Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The thick November fog that had settled over London like a suffocating blanket showed no signs of lifting as the afternoon wore on, transforming Baker Street into a ghostly thoroughfare where gas lamps flickered like dying stars through the murky gloom. I sat in my familiar chair beside the fire, attempting to concentrate on a particularly challenging article in The Lancet regarding new surgical techniques, though my attention was repeatedly drawn to my companion, who had spent the better part of 2 hours in one of his peculiar states of restless inactivity. Sherlock Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his long, angular frame perfectly still, save for the occasional drumming of his fingers against the leather armrest, his keen grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an intensity that suggested he was attempting to divine some hidden meaning from the patterns in the plaster above. The silence had grown so complete that when Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread sounded upon the stairs, followed by her gentle knock, both Holmes and I started slightly. She entered with an expression of considerable perplexity, carrying upon her silver tray a single envelope of heavy cream paper, sealed with dark red wax and bearing no postmark or stamp, only Holmes's name written across its face in an elegant, flowing hand. Holmes had not moved from his recumbent position, yet I observed that his eyes had shifted from their contemplation of the ceiling to focus upon the letter with sudden and unmistakable interest. Mrs. Hudson explained with evident bewilderment that she had been polishing the brass fittings in the entrance hall when she heard the faint sound of something sliding across the floor. Upon investigation, she had discovered the letter lying upon the mat inside our door, though she was certain no one had entered or departed, and she had heard neither footstep nor knock upon the outer door. My friend rose with the fluid grace of a predatory cat, crossing the room in 3 swift strides to pluck the envelope from Mrs. Hudson's grasp. He dismissed our landlady with a distracted nod, already subjecting the mysterious correspondence to the most minute examination. I watched, fascinated as always, as he held it to the lamplight, noting the watermark, testing the weight of the paper between his fingers, and examining the seal with his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson," he said at length, his voice carrying that note of suppressed excitement that always preceded his most brilliant deductions. "No postal markings whatsoever, yet the paper is of the finest quality. Wigmore and Sons, if I am not mistaken, purveyors to the nobility. The seal bears the impression of a signet ring, though the design is deliberately obscured. Most curious of all, note the complete absence of moisture upon the envelope's surface. On such a day as this, anything carried through the streets would bear some trace of the fog's dampness, yet this paper is perfectly dry. Perhaps it was protected in some manner during transport," I suggested. "Precisely my thought, Watson. Either that or it travelled a remarkably short distance. The handwriting, you will observe, is that of an educated person, yet there is a tremor in certain letters that suggests either advanced age or extreme agitation." He slit the envelope open with his paper knife and extracted a single sheet of matching stationery. As he read, his expression shifted through several distinct phases, settling finally into that look of grim satisfaction that I had learned to associate with the promise of an intriguing case. "It would appear," Holmes said, handing me the letter, "that our quiet afternoon is about to be considerably enlivened." The message was brief but sufficiently mysterious to capture my immediate attention. It was signed simply "A Friend in Shadows" and read, "Mr. Holmes, a crime of unusual complexity will be brought to your attention within the next 24 hours. The victim will appear to have died by natural causes, and yet I assure you that murder most foul has been committed. When the case is presented to you, do not trust the obvious suspect, for the true perpetrator is one who stands to lose everything should the truth emerge, The method employed is both ancient and ingenious, leaving no trace that conventional investigation might detect. I write this in the hope that your remarkable abilities may yet prevent a grave injustice. Time is of the utmost importance." Holmes retrieved the letter and read it through once more, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What do you make of it, Watson?" "It is certainly intriguing," I replied, though I confess I am somewhat skeptical. Anonymous warnings of future crimes are often the work of cranks or attention seekers. "Under ordinary circumstances, I might agree," Holmes said, moving to the window and gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. "However, several factors argue against such a simple explanation. First, the quality of the paper and the evident education of the writer suggest someone of considerable standing. Second, the specific mention of an ancient and ingenious method implies knowledge of historical precedents for murder that few possess. Most tellingly, the writer demonstrates a familiarity with my methods and reputation that suggests we move in similar circles." "You believe, then, that the warning is genuine?" "I believe, Watson, that we shall know the answer to that question very soon indeed. Meanwhile, I suggest we prepare ourselves for what may prove to be one of our most challenging cases." He turned from the window, his eyes alight with that fierce intelligence that transformed him from a merely brilliant man into something approaching genius. "For if our mysterious correspondent is correct, we are about to encounter a murder committed by someone clever enough to make it appear as natural death, confident enough to warn us in advance, and desperate enough to risk exposure by doing so." The fog continued to swirl against our windows as Holmes began to pace before the fireplace, his mind already engaged with the puzzle that had been so mysteriously delivered to our door. Whatever the morrow might bring, I was certain that the game, as my friend was fond of saying, was most decidedly afoot. The remainder of that fog-shrouded evening passed with excruciating slowness, though Holmes showed no inclination toward rest. I observed him moving restlessly between his chemistry table and his extensive library, consulting various volumes on toxicology and historical methods of assassination with the methodical precision that marked all his endeavors. He paid particular attention to a leather-bound treatise on the subtle arts of murder employed in ancient civilizations, making occasional notes in his precise handwriting. When I attempted to engage him in conversation regarding our mysterious correspondent, he dismissed my inquiries with an irritable wave, insisting that speculation without data was the cardinal sin of detection. Sleep came fitfully to me that night, disturbed by the intermittent sounds of Holmes moving about our sitting room, and I rose the following morning to find him already dressed and seated at the breakfast table. His appearance suggested he had not retired at all, for his keen grey eyes bore the telltale redness of prolonged wakefulness, and his usually immaculate attire showed signs of a night spent in restless activity. The morning newspapers lay scattered before him, each one thoroughly examined and discarded with evident frustration. "Nothing," he muttered, casting aside the Daily Telegraph with barely concealed irritation. "Not a single report of any death under suspicious circumstances, nor indeed of any sudden demise among persons of note. Either our correspondent was mistaken in his timing, or the crime has not yet been discovered by the authorities." I had scarcely settled myself at the table when the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs announced another visitor. She entered with that particular expression of barely contained excitement that invariably preceded the arrival of Scotland Yard, and a moment later Inspector Lestrade appeared in our doorway. The inspector's sharp features were drawn with concern, and his usually brisk manner seemed tempered by an underlying unease that immediately captured Holmes's attention. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began without his customary pleasantries, "I find myself in need of your expertise regarding a most perplexing matter. Sir Reginald Blackwood was discovered dead in his study early this morning by his manservant. The family physician has certified the cause as heart failure. Yet there are certain circumstances surrounding the case that strike me as decidedly irregular. Holmes had risen from his chair with such sudden energy that he nearly overturned his coffee cup, his listless manner vanishing like morning mist before the sun. Sir Reginald Blackwood of Grosvenor Square, the financier? When precisely was the body discovered? Shortly after 7 o'clock this morning, the manservant, who has been in Sir Reginald's employ for over 20 years, brought his master's morning tea as usual and found him slumped over his desk, quite lifeless. Dr. Pemberton was summoned immediately and pronounced him dead, estimating that death had occurred sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning. "And these irregular circumstances you mention?" Holmes inquired, his voice carefully controlled. Though I detected the undercurrent of intense interest beneath his studied calm, Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Several factors trouble me, Mr. Holmes. First, Sir Reginald was known to be in excellent health for a man of his years. He maintained regular habits, consulted his physician quarterly, and showed no previous signs of heart disease. Second, his study was found locked from the inside with the key still in the lock, yet a window that is normally kept fastened was discovered slightly ajar. Most peculiar of all, a half-written letter was found upon his desk, the pen still clutched in his right hand, yet the ink had not dried properly, despite the passage of several hours." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with me before turning back to Lestrade. "The contents of this unfinished correspondence, it appears to be addressed to his solicitor and concerns a significant alteration to his will. The letter breaks off mid-sentence, as though he was suddenly interrupted or overcome. Fascinating. I presume there are members of the household who might benefit from Sir Reginald's demise. His nephew, Captain James Blackwood, stands to inherit the bulk of the estate. The captain has accumulated considerable gambling debts and has been pressing his uncle for financial assistance with increasing desperation. There is also the matter of Miss Catherine Thornbury, Sir Reginald's ward, who was to receive a substantial legacy under the current will. Finally, there is the private secretary, Mr. Victor Ashford, who has managed Sir Reginald's business affairs for the past 5 years and would have intimate knowledge of his financial situation." Holmes reached for his coat with decisive movement. "Watson, I believe your medical expertise may prove invaluable in this matter. Lestrade, I trust the scene has been preserved exactly as it was found." "Indeed, I took the liberty of posting a constable at the study door to ensure nothing was disturbed, pending your examination." "Excellent foresight." Holmes paused at the door, his hand upon the handle. "Tell me, Inspector, which of these individuals would you consider the most obvious suspect?" Lestrade considered for a moment. "The nephew, certainly. Captain Blackwood was heard arguing with his uncle only 2 evenings ago, and his financial difficulties are well known. He had both motive and opportunity." "I see." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful as he recalled the anonymous letter's warning against trusting the obvious suspect. "Then we shall pay particular attention to Captain Blackwood while keeping our minds open to less apparent possibilities. The game, as I observed to Watson yesterday evening, is most decidedly afoot." As we descended to the waiting police carriage, I could not suppress a growing sense of unease. The mysterious correspondent had proven accurate in predicting both the timing and the apparent naturalness of the death. I found myself wondering, with mounting apprehension, whether the third element of the prophecy would prove equally prescient, and whether we were walking into a carefully orchestrated deception designed to ensnare the very obvious suspect we had been warned against. The carriage journey through London's fog-choked streets afforded Holmes an opportunity for that peculiar form of silent contemplation which invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. I observed him sitting motionless in the corner, his sharp profile barely visible in the gloom, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he absorbed every detail Lestrade had provided about the Blackwood household. The inspector, consulting his notebook with characteristic thoroughness, described Sir Reginald as a man of rigid habits and exacting standards, one whose fortune had been built through shrewd investments in railway stocks and colonial enterprises, and whose household reflected the austere discipline that marked his approach to both business and personal affairs. Grosvenor Square materialized from the yellow fog like something from a fever dream, its elegant Georgian facades rendered ghostly and insubstantial by the thick atmosphere. The Blackwood residence loomed before us, an imposing townhouse whose darkened windows suggested a household paralyzed by sudden tragedy. A uniformed constable stood sentinel at the entrance, admitting us at Lestrade's word, and we were conducted through a richly appointed entrance hall by the butler, a dignified man of perhaps 60 years, who introduced himself as Graves. His composure was admirable, though I noted the slight tremor in his hands and the grey pallor that spoke of genuine shock at his master's unexpected demise. The study occupied the ground floor at the rear of the house, a spacious chamber lined from floor to ceiling with mahogany bookshelves and dominated by an enormous desk of matching dark wood. Sir Reginald's body had been carefully moved to his bedchamber, but Holmes insisted upon examining the scene first before it could yield any further secrets to less observant eyes. The room held that peculiar stillness that seems to settle upon places where death has recently visited, and the morning light filtering through the partially opened window cast long shadows across the Persian carpet. My friend moved about the chamber with the focused intensity of a bloodhound following a scent, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic from his waistcoat pocket. He examined the massive oak desk with minute attention, noting the position of papers, the angle of the inkwell, and most particularly the unfinished letter that lay beneath a silver paperweight. The correspondence, addressed to Sir Reginald's solicitor, broke off abruptly mid-sentence with the words, "Furthermore, with respect to my nephew, Captain James Blackwood, I have at last resolved—" The ink possessed a peculiar sheen that immediately captured Holmes's attention. "Most instructive," he murmured, lifting the inkwell and swirling its contents gently. "This is not standard commercial ink, Watson. It has been thickened, likely with gum arabic solution, which retards the drying process. A curious modification for a man writing a hasty letter to his solicitor." He replaced the vessel and surveyed the desk's surface with growing interest. "Tell me, do you notice anything missing from this arrangement?" I studied the orderly collection of papers, blotter, lamp, and various writing implements. "It appears quite complete to me." "There is no blotting paper," Holmes declared, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction. "A gentleman of Sir Reginald's generation, writing with a fountain pen, would invariably employ a blotter. Yet there is none on the desk nor in the wastebasket. Its absence is as significant as the modified ink." He then turned his attention to the window, which stood open perhaps 2 inches, despite the November chill. His examination of the frame revealed faint scratches on the varnish, recent enough that the wood beneath remained light in colour. Moving to a small side table, he lifted a crystal glass from its silver tray, holding it delicately by the rim against the window's light. "Observe this faint residue around the rim, Watson. It is neither dust nor a fingerprint, but rather the trace of some waxy substance." He set the glass down with infinite care before turning to address Lestrade. "I should like to speak with the manservant who discovered the body." Hodges proved to be a reliable witness despite his evident distress. He confirmed that Sir Reginald had retired to his study after dinner at 8 o'clock, as was his invariable custom, with strict instructions not to be disturbed. The household had retired around 11, and Hodges had personally secured all ground-floor windows before seeking his own quarters. His shock at discovering his master dead that morning was clearly genuine, though Holmes pressed him regarding Sir Reginald's state of mind in recent days. "He seemed troubled, sir," Hodges admitted reluctantly. "Received several visitors whose names he didn't share with the staff. There was that terrible row with Captain Blackwood 2 evenings past, voices raised throughout the house, though I couldn't say what it concerned." As we prepared to interview the other household members, Holmes paused at the study door, his expression grave. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable subtlety, Watson. The evidence suggests a crime of unusual sophistication, one designed to appear as natural death while concealing a most ingenious method of murder." The drawing room where we assembled the household members possessed that peculiar atmosphere of enforced civility that often accompanies sudden tragedy among the upper classes. Heavy velvet curtains blocked much of the wan November light, and the gas lamps cast flickering shadows across the assembled faces as each person awaited their turn to be questioned. Holmes positioned himself near the fireplace, his keen eyes already cataloguing every detail of posture, expression, and nervous gesture displayed by those who had shared Sir Reginald's final hours. Captain James Blackwood was the first to present himself for examination, and his appearance immediately confirmed Lestrade's earlier assessment of his character. Though he maintained the bearing of a military officer, the telltale signs of dissolution were evident in his bloodshot eyes, the slight tremor of his hands, and the rumpled condition of his otherwise fashionable attire. He accepted the chair Holmes indicated with an air of defiant resignation, as though steeling himself for an ordeal he had long anticipated. "Captain Blackwood," Holmes began, his tone deceptively conversational, "I understand you had occasion to speak with your uncle 2 evenings past. Would you characterize that conversation as amicable?" The captain's jaw tightened visibly before he replied, "I make no secret of our disagreement, Mr. Holmes. I had requested his assistance with certain pressing financial obligations, and he refused in terms I found unnecessarily harsh. He accused me of squandering my prospects and threatened to alter his will unless I reformed my habits immediately. Yet you remained in London rather than returning to your duties. I am currently on extended leave. My uncle's sudden death, while tragic, could not have come at a more unfortunate time from my perspective. Had I known he seriously intended to change his will, I would have made every effort to reconcile our differences." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers forming that characteristic steeple beneath his chin. "Where were you between midnight and 3 o'clock this morning?" "At my club, the Albany. I dined there and remained until the early hours, attempting to forget our quarrel through the application of rather too much brandy. I can provide witnesses to my presence there, though I confess the evening became somewhat hazy toward its conclusion." When Holmes dismissed the captain with a curt nod, I observed Lestrade's expression of satisfaction. The inspector clearly believed he had identified his culprit, though Holmes's face remained impassive as he requested Miss Catherine Thornbury's presence. The young woman who entered presented a striking contrast to the dissolute captain. She was perhaps 24 years of age, possessed of that particular combination of intelligence and composure that marks a well-educated woman of good family. Her mourning dress was elegant in its simplicity, and her grey eyes met Holmes's scrutiny with admirable directness, though I noted the slight tremor in her hands that suggested her calm required considerable effort to maintain. "Miss Thornbury," Holmes began, his tone notably gentler, "you have resided in this household for several years as Sir Reginald's ward. You were aware of his intentions regarding your future?" He was most generous, Mr. Holmes. Last year he informed me of his plans to provide a substantial dowry and annual income sufficient to ensure my independence. I was deeply grateful, though I had hoped to remain in his service, managing his household affairs, as he had no wife to perform such duties. Did you observe anything unusual in Sir Reginald's behaviour during recent days? Miss Thornbury hesitated, her hands clasping more tightly in her lap. He seemed troubled, certainly. He spent longer hours in his study than was customary, and began locking the door even during daylight hours, which was quite unlike him. On the evening before his death, I encountered him in the corridor, and he appeared startled to see me, almost as though he had forgotten I was in the house. Where were you last night between midnight and 3 o'clock? In my bedchamber on the second floor. I retired at 10:30 and heard nothing unusual until my maid brought news of the tragedy this morning. Our final interview was with Mr. Victor Ashford, the private secretary, whose entrance was marked by that precise, unobtrusive manner that characterized his every action. He was a man of unremarkable appearance, save for intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he seated himself with the careful attention to propriety that marked the professional servant of a great house. "Mr. Ashford," Holmes began, "you were intimately familiar with Sir Reginald's business affairs. Had he expressed any particular concerns of late?" "Sir Reginald was a man who kept his own counsel," Ashford replied in measured tones. "However, I was aware that certain investments had not performed as anticipated, and he had been liquidating assets to cover temporary difficulties. He preferred to shield the family from such mundane concerns." "You had unrestricted access to his study." "Naturally, my duties required it. I maintained his correspondence, managed his appointments, and ensured his privacy when he requested it." Holmes rose abruptly and moved to examine the fireplace, where I now noticed a small quantity of ash in the grate. "Someone has burned something here recently," he observed, carefully collecting a sample. "Not paper, but something of heavier composition. Fabric, perhaps." Returning to the window, he knelt to examine the carpet with his magnifying glass. "Observe these faint impressions, Watson. Something heavy was placed here, and recently. The window sill bears minute scratches consistent with the use of some mechanical device." Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. "Then you suspect the captain, Mr. Holmes? His motive is clear, and his alibi questionable at best." Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful. "The evidence against Captain Blackwood is indeed compelling, Inspector, perhaps too compelling. Our anonymous correspondent warned against accepting the obvious conclusion, and I find myself inclined to heed that advice. We are dealing with a mind of considerable subtlety, one that understands both human nature and the principles of criminal investigation well enough to construct a most elaborate deception." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the study door, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene once more. "There are still questions that demand answers, Watson. The modified ink, the carefully arranged evidence, the precise timing of events. Before we can speak definitively of guilt or innocence, we must understand the true nature of the weapon employed in this most ingenious crime." The fog had begun to lift slightly as we emerged from the Blackwood residence, though the mystery surrounding Sir Reginald's death seemed to deepen with each revelation. Holmes's expression suggested that his formidable intellect was already engaged with the puzzle's more subtle complexities, and I found myself wondering whether the obvious suspect would prove to be the victim of an even more elaborate scheme than we had yet imagined. The carriage journey back to Baker Street passed in contemplative silence, Holmes's angular profile etched against the fog-dimmed window as his mind processed the morning's revelations. I had learned to recognize this particular quality of stillness in my companion, the outward calm that masked intense intellectual activity, and I refrained from interrupting his deliberations with premature observations. Only when we had reached our familiar lodgings did he emerge from his reverie, moving immediately to his chemistry table with the focused energy that invariably preceded his most significant discoveries. For the better part of an hour, Holmes subjected the samples he had collected to rigorous analysis, the acrid smell of various reagents soon filling our sitting room. The ash from Sir Reginald's fireplace received particular attention, as did the waxy residue from the crystal glass, each substance revealing its secrets under his methodical examination. I observed him comparing results against reference samples from his extensive collection, his expression shifting from puzzlement to dawning comprehension. "Most illuminating, Watson," he declared at length, straightening from his microscope. "The ash contains traces of specially treated silk thread, virtually invisible to the naked eye, yet strong enough to support considerable weight. The waxy residue proves to be a mixture of beeswax and resin, but not of the common variety. This particular composition was used historically in the construction of what might charitably be called theatrical props, though their purpose was decidedly more sinister than mere entertainment." Before I could press him for elaboration, Mrs. Hudson announced an unexpected visitor. Miss Catherine Thornbury stood upon our threshold, her earlier composure replaced by evident distress and determination. She apologized profusely for the intrusion, explaining that she had been tormented by information she felt compelled to share away from the watchful eyes of the Blackwood household. Holmes gestured for her to be seated, his penetrating gaze seeming to perceive the struggle between loyalty and conscience that marked her every gesture. "You have remembered something of significance, Miss Thornbury. Or perhaps you withheld certain details during our earlier conversation out of discretion or fear." The young woman's hands twisted nervously in her lap as she gathered her courage. "I have been dishonest with you, Mr. Holmes, though not from any desire to obstruct justice. 3 nights ago, unable to sleep, I descended to the library for a book. As I passed Sir Reginald's study, I heard voices within, though the hour was well past midnight. One voice was unmistakably my guardian's, but the other I could not identify with certainty. They spoke in hushed tones, but I distinctly heard Sir Reginald mention ancient poisons and methods that leave no trace. The unknown voice spoke of historical precedents, mentioning the name Borgia, and there was discussion of a technique involving specially prepared candles. Holmes leaned forward with sudden intensity. "You are quite certain of these details? The reference to the Borgias and to candles specifically?" "Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes. The conversation disturbed me greatly, for I had never heard my guardian speak of such dark matters. When he was found dead, I feared that revealing what I had overheard might cast suspicion upon someone dear to me." Her flush confirmed what Holmes had already deduced. "Mr. Victor Ashford and I have formed an attachment, though we have been most discreet. Sir Reginald would never have approved of his ward marrying his secretary, regardless of Victor's admirable qualities. After Miss Thornbury departed, having extracted a promise that her confidence would be respected insofar as justice permitted, Holmes began pacing before the fireplace with renewed vigour. "The Borgias, Watson, you recall your Renaissance history, I trust. That infamous Italian family whose name became synonymous with the poisoner's art. They employed methods so subtle that their victims often appeared to die of natural causes, particularly a technique involving specially prepared candles infused with toxic compounds that would release deadly vapours when burned." The implication struck me with considerable force. "Then you believe Sir Reginald was murdered by such means?" "I believe we are dealing with someone who has adapted this ancient method for modern use, employing the invisible thread to create a mechanical triggering device. Consider the evidence. the modified ink that would not dry properly, suggesting unusual atmospheric conditions, the open window, forced after the fact to disperse lingering vapours, the missing blotting paper, which might have absorbed traces of the poison, and most tellingly the chemical analysis confirming the presence of both the delivery mechanism and the waxy residue of the murder weapon. Holmes moved to his bookshelf, extracting a volume on Renaissance history and flipping to a familiar passage. The Borgia method involved mixing poison into specially prepared wax, which would release toxic vapors when heated. In our case, someone has created a hybrid technique, combining the historical precedent with modern mechanical precision. The invisible thread could have been attached to the door or chair, designed to trigger the release of poison gas when Sir Reginald assumed his customary position at his desk. But who would possess both the knowledge to employ such a method and the access to implement it? Holmes's expression grew grave as he moved to his writing desk and produced the anonymous warning letter. That, Watson, brings us to the most troubling aspect of this case. Observe once more the handwriting of our mysterious correspondent. Note the particular formation of certain letters and the slight hesitation in the pen strokes. We have been warned against trusting the obvious suspect, yet someone with intimate knowledge of both the crime and the household felt compelled to guide our investigation. He paused at the window, gazing out at the thickening fog. Before we can proceed further, we must expand our understanding of Sir Reginald's recent activities. His solicitor may hold the key to identifying not only the mysterious late-night visitor Miss Thornbury overheard, but also the broader circumstances that led to his murder. Within the hour, we found ourselves in the offices of Messrs. Cobbett and Merton in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Mr. Cobbett, a grave man of middle years, received us with the cautious dignity of his profession, though mention of Sir Reginald's name caused his composure to slip momentarily. He confirmed that Sir Reginald had requested an appointment for the very afternoon following his death to discuss alterations to his will based upon a letter received 3 days prior. The letter, which Cobbett produced with evident reluctance, revealed Sir Reginald's intention to reduce his nephew's inheritance substantially while increasing Miss Thornbury's portion. Most intriguingly, the solicitor revealed that Sir Reginald had spoken in guarded terms of a gentleman connected with colonial ventures, an individual whose demands he found increasingly intolerable and whom he had once described in a moment of irritation as a man who deals in other men's misfortunes. As we departed Lincoln's Inn Fields, Holmes's expression had grown more intent than ever. We have our second angle of approach, Watson. Behind Sir Reginald's domestic circle stands another figure, half seen yet very real, someone who profits from disaster and possessed sufficient leverage to drive a man of iron habits to midnight composition and desperate measures. Until we discover his identity, we shall see only the surface ripples of a much deeper disturbance. The fog continued to thicken as we returned to Baker Street, and I found myself sharing Holmes's sense that we were approaching a critical juncture in the investigation. The anonymous correspondent's warning against trusting the obvious suspect had proven prophetic, but the true perpetrator of this ingenious crime remained several moves ahead of even my friend's formidable intellect. Yet I could see in Holmes's manner that he was beginning to perceive the outline of the conspiracy, and I knew that when the final revelation came, it would illuminate not merely a single murder, but an entire web of deception that reached far beyond the walls of the Blackwood residence. Holmes's manner grew increasingly restless over the following hours, his usual composed demeanour giving way to the fevered intensity that marked his most challenging cases. He paced the length of our sitting room with mechanical precision, pausing only to consult his chemical analyses or peer once more at the anonymous letter that had initiated our involvement. The physical evidence pointed toward an elaborate historical method, yet the human elements of the case remained frustratingly opaque, as though we were observing only the surface ripples of a much deeper disturbance. His brooding was interrupted shortly after 10 o'clock by the arrival of Inspector Lestrade, whose triumphant bearing immediately captured Holmes's attention. The Scotland Yard man entered with barely contained satisfaction, removing his hat with a flourish as he announced his success. "We have our man, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade declared, settling into the chair I indicated. "Captain James Blackwood was arrested 2 hours ago on the strength of compelling evidence. A search of his lodgings revealed a vial of arsenic concealed within a hollowed-out military history, and we have located a curiosity dealer in the Strand who sold him invisible silk threads and certain wax compounds only last week. Furthermore, a cab driver has come forward who transported a passenger matching the captain's description from his club to Grosvenor Square and back again during the critical hours." Holmes received this news with that maddening calm that invariably preceded his most devastating observations. "Arsenic, you say? Rather crude for someone capable of such sophisticated planning. And these materials from the curiosity shop, did the proprietor seem entirely certain of his identification?" Lestrade's confidence wavered slightly. He recognized the captain without hesitation when shown a photograph. "I see. Yet arsenic produces symptoms entirely inconsistent with Sir Reginald's apparent heart failure. The evidence seems almost too perfectly arranged, Inspector, as though someone wished to ensure the captain's conviction." Holmes moved to his desk and withdrew a telegram that had arrived during the morning. "My brother Mycroft has provided information regarding Sir Reginald's colonial associate, one Edmund Carstairs, recently returned from Malaya under suspicion of fraud. Carstairs was observed entering the Blackwood residence through the servants' entrance on the evening of November 11th. Within the hour, we found ourselves confronting Carstairs at the Langham Hotel, where his evident preparation for hasty departure confirmed Holmes's suspicions. The colonial manager's initial denials crumbled under Holmes's methodical questioning, revealing a crucial piece of the puzzle that transformed our understanding of the entire case. "Yes, I visited Sir Reginald that evening," Carstairs admitted, his florid face pale with fear. "He threatened to expose my business practices, to see me imprisoned for what were merely standard colonial procedures, but I swear I left him alive. What disturbed me most was his strange preoccupation with historical methods of assassination. He asked me about poisons that could be administered without detection, as though he expected someone to attempt his murder." Holmes leaned forward with sudden intensity. "Sir Reginald knew someone intended him harm?" He seemed resigned to it, almost as though he had accepted the inevitability of his death. "He was researching the very methods that might be used against him, Mr. Holmes. It was most peculiar behavior for a man who held my future in his hands." This revelation cast the entire investigation in a new light, and Holmes insisted we return immediately to the Blackwood residence. In the study, he conducted a more thorough examination of the ventilation system, discovering that a hidden grate behind the bookshelves had been deliberately sealed to concentrate any airborne toxins. Moving to the adjoining conservatory, we made the most significant discovery yet, a concealed workshop containing half-finished candles, invisible silk thread, and a vial of clear liquid that Holmes identified as concentrated digitalis. "Here is our murder weapon, Watson," he declared grimly. "Digitalis extracted from foxglove, vaporized through specially prepared candles, and concentrated by the modified ventilation. The silk thread provided a mechanical trigger, activated when Sir Reginald assumed his position at the desk. The arsenic in the captain's lodgings was merely theatrical misdirection." The sophistication of the method and the intimate knowledge of the household it required pointed towards someone with both scientific expertise and unrestricted access to the residence. Holmes carefully replaced the evidence, his expression grave, with the realization that the true murderer remained not only at liberty, but likely within the very walls that surrounded us. "We are dealing with a mind of exceptional cunning, Watson," he observed as we prepared to leave. "Someone who understood that Sir Reginald suspected the plot against him, who deliberately left a trail leading to Captain Blackwood, and who possesses both the knowledge to employ such an ancient method and the modern scientific training to adapt it for contemporary use. Tonight, we shall return here under cover of darkness. I believe our quarry will attempt to retrieve these incriminating materials, and when they do, we shall finally unmask the architect of this most ingenious crime." The fog had begun to thicken again as we departed Grosvenor Square, and I found myself reflecting that while the meteorological gloom showed signs of lifting, the human mystery surrounding Sir Reginald's death had revealed depths of calculation and malice that chilled me more than any November wind. The remainder of that fog-shrouded evening found Holmes in a state of focused preparation that I had witnessed only during our most critical cases. He moved about our lodgings with methodical precision, selecting items that would prove essential for the night's vigil. A dark lantern, his revolver, a coil of thin rope, and several small glass vials from his chemical supplies. His manner suggested not merely confidence in his deductions, but the grim satisfaction of a hunter who has finally identified his quarry's hiding place. "Before we depart, Watson," Holmes remarked, sealing a brief note in an envelope, "I shall employ a stratagem that should force our murderer's hand. This memorandum, ostensibly a reminder to myself regarding tomorrow's forensic analysis of the conservatory compounds, will be left where it cannot fail to catch the attention of anyone with access to the Blackwood household. The prospect of Scotland Yard's arrival at dawn should prove sufficiently motivating to compel immediate action." As the November darkness settled over London like a suffocating shroud, we made our way once more to Grosvenor Square. The fog had returned with renewed intensity, transforming the familiar streets into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertain forms. Holmes had arranged our entry through the same servant's door that Carstairs had utilized, and we slipped into the darkened residence with the caution of experienced practitioners in the art of clandestine observation. The conservatory proved an ideal location for our surveillance, its glass walls admitting sufficient moonlight to render the space navigable, while the dense arrangement of tropical plants provided excellent concealment. Holmes positioned us behind a screen of towering ferns that afforded an unobstructed view of both the concealed workshop entrance and the study door beyond. The air was heavy with the exotic scents of orchids and the earthy smell of rich soil, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere that seemed incongruous with our grim purpose. "The psychology of our adversary is most instructive," Holmes whispered as we settled into our hiding place. "The anonymous letter was not merely a warning, Watson, but an act of supreme vanity." The author could not resist ensuring that their intellectual superiority would be appreciated by the one man in London capable of understanding the elegance of their scheme. They warned us against the obvious suspect because the framing of Captain Blackwood was merely theatrical misdirection designed to satisfy conventional investigation, while the true architect remained safely in the shadows. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the distant chiming of church bells and the occasional settling of the great house's timbers. Holmes remained motionless as carved stone, though I could sense the coiled tension in his frame as he waited for his calculations to prove correct. It was well past midnight when we heard the soft, metallic click of a key in a lock, followed by footsteps that moved with the confidence of complete familiarity rather than the hesitation of an intruder. A shuttered lantern cast a narrow beam of light across the conservatory floor, as the figure approached the concealed workshop with practiced efficiency. The intruder manipulated the hidden mechanism with ease, revealing the small laboratory beyond, and began gathering the incriminating evidence with methodical haste. In the lantern's glow, I could see the familiar spectacles and precisely parted hair of Mr. Victor Ashford, Sir Reginald's trusted private secretary. Holmes chose that moment to emerge from our concealment, his voice cutting through the silence with devastating precision. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford. Or should I address you by your true name, Dr. Adrian Thornbury? Late of the Royal College of Physicians and brother to Miss Catherine Thornbury." The effect was electric. Ashford spun toward us, his hand moving instinctively toward his pocket, before freezing as he observed my revolver trained steadily upon his person. In the lamplight, his features underwent a complete transformation, the mask of the deferential secretary falling away to reveal the harder, more calculating intelligence beneath. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice stripped of its previous civility. "I suspected from the moment Miss Thornbury mentioned the midnight conversation she overheard," Holmes replied calmly. The reference to the Borgias and historical poisons suggested someone with both medical training and specialized knowledge. Your resemblance to Miss Thornbury, though subtle, became apparent once I knew to look for it. Most conclusively, the handwriting on the anonymous letter matched samples of your work I obtained from Sir Reginald's correspondence files, despite your attempts at disguise through deliberate hesitation and modified letter formation. Ashford's bitter laugh echoed through the conservatory. "You are indeed as formidable as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I am Catherine's brother, forced to abandon my medical career after a scandal involving experimental treatments that resulted in several deaths. Sir Reginald discovered my true identity and threatened to expose me, to destroy the new life I had carefully constructed over 5 years. He would have ruined Catherine as well, withdrawing her inheritance and casting her out without reference or means of support. So you researched historical methods of undetectable murder," Holmes continued, "constructed an elaborate mechanism to deliver vaporized digitalis and carefully arranged evidence to implicate Captain Blackwood, knowing his debts and public quarrel with Sir Reginald would make him the obvious suspect. Yet you could not resist sending that anonymous letter, hoping to guide my investigation away from your false trail while ensuring that your intellectual superiority would be recognized. I wanted the truth known eventually, Mr. Holmes, but not at the cost of my sister's happiness. I thought perhaps you might identify the real method without tracing it to its source." His shoulders sagged in defeat. "I see now the futility of such reasoning. A mind capable of solving the puzzle would inevitably follow all threads to their origin." Ashford's hand darted suddenly toward his waistcoat pocket, not for a weapon, but for a small glass phial he had evidently reserved for this contingency. Holmes, anticipating the movement, sprang forward with tiger-like agility, striking the secretary's arm and sending the vial shattering against the stone floor. The acrid scent of bitter almonds filled the air, confirming that the desperate man had prepared a final escape should his elaborate deception unravel. "Not tonight, Mr. Ashford," Holmes declared, securing the struggling man while I assisted with the restraints. "Justice will be served through proper channels. Inspector Lestrade is waiting in the street below, and he will be most interested to learn that his prisoner in the cells is innocent, while the true architect of Sir Reginald's death stands before us." As we prepared to summon the authorities, Holmes paused to examine the contents of the secret workshop one final time. "A mind of considerable brilliance perverted to the service of murder," he observed grimly. "The tragedy lies not merely in Sir Reginald's death, but in the waste of intellectual gifts that might have served humanity rather than destroying it. the anonymous letter will stand as evidence of a conscience that could warn against injustice even while perpetrating the greatest injustice of all. The fog was beginning to lift as we emerged from the Blackwood residence with our prisoner, though the human mystery that had consumed our attention for the past 2 days had revealed depths of calculation and desperation that would linger in my memory long after the meteorological gloom had cleared. Holmes had once again demonstrated that no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand the application of rigorous logic and patient observation, though the cost in human suffering served as a sobering reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the most civilized facades. Inspector Lestrade's arrival with 2 constables brought the night's dramatic events to their inevitable conclusion, though his expression upon discovering Victor Ashford in custody, while Captain Blackwood languished in the cells, revealed the complete bewilderment of a man whose carefully constructed case had crumbled beneath him. The Scotland Yard detective's sharp features cycled through confusion, indignation, and finally grudging comprehension as Holmes methodically outlined the elaborate deception that had been constructed to sacrifice an innocent man while shielding the true perpetrator from suspicion. But the evidence against the captain was so compelling, Lestrade protested, as Ashford was secured in the police wagon, his head bowed in defeat. The arsenic in his lodgings, the curiosity dealer who identified him purchasing the silk threads and wax compounds, the cab driver who placed him at the scene during the critical hours. Holmes accepted the cigar I offered him, his expression grave in the pale light of dawn that was beginning to penetrate the November fog. Precisely the problem, Inspector. The evidence was too perfect, too conveniently discovered. Ashford planted the arsenic during one of several visits he made to the captain's rooms under the pretense of delivering messages from Sir Reginald. As for the curiosity dealer, I visited his establishment earlier this evening with photographs of both men. When presented with both images simultaneously, rather than being led toward a predetermined conclusion, he admitted his customer more closely resembled the secretary, though a false moustache and military bearing had created sufficient resemblance to the captain for a casual identification. The inspector shook his head in reluctant admiration as we returned to the Blackwood residence to complete our investigation. The fellow thought of everything, but how did you first suspect that Ashford and this Dr. Thornbury were the same person? Several factors converged, Holmes replied. Pausing to examine once more the scene of our confrontation in the conservatory, Miss Thornbury's evident attachment to the secretary seemed disproportionate unless some deeper bond existed between them. More significantly, the anonymous letter demonstrated intimate knowledge of both the household and the historical methods employed in the murder. The handwriting, though disguised, contained subtle characteristics I had observed in Ashford's ledger entries. Most tellingly, the tremor you noticed in certain letters was not the result of age or agitation, but a deliberate affectation unevenly applied. When compared with samples of his normal script, the similarities were unmistakable to a trained observer. We were interrupted by the entrance of Miss Catherine Thornbury, who had been awakened by the commotion and now stood in the doorway with the pale, stricken expression of one who has already divined the terrible truth. Holmes rose immediately, his manner shifting from analytical detachment to gentle gravity as he confirmed that her brother had been taken into custody for Sir Reginald's murder. The young woman sank into the nearest chair, her composure finally shattering under the weight of this revelation. "He did it for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the dying fire. When Sir Reginald discovered Adrian's true identity and threatened to expose us both, Victor said he would not allow me to be cast into the street without reference or means. I never imagined he would contemplate such a terrible crime. Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the lightening sky as he spoke. "Your brother acted from a twisted sense of protective duty, Miss Thornbury, but his method reveals the same moral corruption that destroyed his medical career. The murder weapon was ingenious in its historical inspiration, yet thoroughly modern in its execution. He created specially prepared candles containing sealed capsules of concentrated digitalis suspended by the invisible silk thread within the flame. As the candle burned down to a predetermined point, calculated to coincide with Sir Reginald's late-night work habits, the heat melted the wax seal and instantly vaporized the poison. I observed Lestrade taking careful notes as Holmes continued his explanation. In the modified ink on Sir Reginald's unfinished letter was not merely thickened to retard drying, but chemically treated to react with the digitalis vapors, creating a molecular signature that confirmed the poison's presence in the air. The sealed ventilation grate ensured the deadly mist remained concentrated around the desk, while the forced window created the illusion of an intruder's escape route while actually serving to disperse any remaining traces of the compound. "But why the elaborate warning letter?" Lestrade inquired. "Why risk exposure by contacting Mr. Holmes at all?" Holmes turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "Vanity, Inspector. Dr. Thornbury possessed a brilliant mind that craved recognition for its achievements, even criminal ones. The anonymous letter allowed him to boast of his intellectual superiority to the one man he deemed worthy of the challenge, while simultaneously attempting to guide my investigation away from the obvious suspect he had so carefully prepared. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of arrogance. As dawn broke fully over London, we took our leave of the Blackwood residence, the fog finally surrendering to pale November sunlight that seemed to promise better days ahead. Miss Thornbury's future remained clouded by her association with her brother's crime despite her complete innocence, while Captain Blackwood would soon taste freedom, though whether he would profit from this narrow escape remained doubtful. The human cost of the case weighed heavily upon Holmes as we returned to Baker Street, his usual satisfaction in a successful resolution, tempered by the recognition that brilliant minds, when corrupted by moral weakness, could create tragedies that extended far beyond their intended victims. "Another case concluded, Watson," Holmes remarked, as our carriage navigated the awakening streets. "Yet I find little triumph in this particular victory. We have unmasked a murderer and prevented a grave injustice, but at what cost? A young woman's life is forever altered, a promising medical career lies in ruins, and society loses what might have been a valuable contributor to human knowledge. It serves as a sobering reminder that the greatest crimes are often committed not by the ignorant or desperate, but by those possessed of sufficient intelligence to believe they can transcend the moral laws that govern lesser mortals." The morning sun continued to strengthen as we approached Baker Street, and I could see that Holmes's remarkable mind was already beginning to organize the complex threads of the case into the comprehensive explanation that would soon illuminate every aspect of this most ingenious deception. Yet for the moment he seemed content to sit in contemplative silence, the melancholy that sometimes followed our most intellectually satisfying victories serving as a reminder that even the most precise application of logic cannot entirely heal the wounds inflicted by human folly and misguided devotion. The following afternoon found us assembled once more in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, where Holmes had requested the attendance of all parties most intimately connected with the tragic affair. Inspector Lestrade occupied his customary chair with notebook at the ready, while Captain James Blackwood sat near the window, his manner reflecting the curious mixture of relief and wounded dignity that marked a man recently reprieved from the shadow of the gallows. Miss Catherine Thornbury had accepted our invitation despite the obvious pain it caused her, recognizing perhaps that understanding the full scope of her brother's actions might provide some measure of closure to the catastrophe that had engulfed her life. Holmes stood before the fireplace, his lean figure silhouetted against the dancing flames as he began his methodical reconstruction of events. The case of Sir Reginald Blackwood presents a study in misdirection and psychological manipulation that ranks among the most sophisticated criminal schemes I have encountered. To comprehend how Dr. Adrian Thornbury, masquerading as the humble secretary Victor Ashford, orchestrated this murder, we must first understand the pressures that drove him to such desperate measures. He paused to light his pipe, the familiar ritual seeming to organize his thoughts before continuing. 5 years ago, Dr. Thornbury fled London under the shadow of scandal involving experimental treatments that resulted in patient deaths. He assumed the identity of Victor Ashford and secured employment with Sir Reginald, demonstrating exceptional competence while concealing his true background. His sister Catherine became Sir Reginald's ward through arrangements Dr. Thornbury facilitated while maintaining the fiction that they were unrelated individuals. Miss Thornbury's composure remained admirable, though I observed the slight tremor in her hands as Holmes continued. The arrangement proved satisfactory until Sir Reginald discovered Victor Ashford's true identity through his extensive business connections. Rather than dismissing him immediately, Sir Reginald chose to use this knowledge as leverage, extracting increasingly onerous concessions while threatening exposure. The final provocation came when Sir Reginald announced his intention to alter his will, casting Miss Thornbury from his household without reference or means of support as punishment for her brother's deception. Captain Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "I had no knowledge of any of this, Mr. Holmes. My quarrel with my uncle concerned only my debts and his refusal to advance me funds." "Indeed, and your predicament was precisely what Dr. Thornbury intended," Holmes acknowledged. "He studied your circumstances carefully, recognizing that your public disputes with Sir Reginald, combined with your financial desperation, would make you the ideal scapegoat. The murder weapon itself was a masterpiece of historical research combined with modern chemical knowledge. Dr. Thornbury created specially prepared candles containing sealed capsules of concentrated digitalis suspended within the wax by invisible silk threads. These candles replaced the ordinary ones Sir Reginald habitually burned during his late-night correspondence. Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved the various pieces of evidence he had collected. As the flame consumed the wax to a predetermined depth, calculated based on Sir Reginald's work patterns, the heat melted the capsule seal and instantly vaporized the poison. The probability of success was virtually assured, as Dr. Thornbury had prepared multiple candles positioned strategically throughout the study. The modified ventilation system, which he had subtly altered over several months, ensured that any released vapors would concentrate around the desk rather than dispersing harmlessly. Lestrade leaned forward with professional interest. The symptoms of digitalis poisoning closely mimic cardiac arrest, particularly in a man of Sir Reginald's age. Dr. Pemberton's diagnosis was entirely reasonable and would have remained unchallenged had not our anonymous correspondent drawn attention to the case. "Precisely the point, Inspector," Holmes replied, producing the cream-coloured letter. "This document remains the most fascinating aspect of the entire affair. It is a psychological portrait of the criminal mind in conflict with itself. Dr. Thornbury could not bear for his intellectual achievement to go unrecognized, even if that recognition must come from the very man who would ultimately destroy him. By warning me against the obvious suspect, he ensured my continued engagement while simultaneously demonstrating his superior intellect." Miss Thornbury spoke quietly, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. My brother always possessed a brilliant mind, Mr. Holmes, but his obsession with protecting me transformed that brilliance into something monstrous. I wish he had trusted that I could face whatever consequences might come. The tragedy of intelligence without moral foundation, Holmes observed gravely.
Your brother's medical knowledge might have contributed significantly to human welfare had it been guided by ethical principles rather than corrupted by fear and desperation. As our guests departed, each carrying the burden of knowledge that would reshape their understanding of recent events, Holmes settled into his chair with the exhausted satisfaction of a task completed. The fog had begun to gather once more outside our windows, and I found myself reflecting that while the meteorological gloom showed signs of lifting, the human mysteries we encountered suggested that moral obscurity could persist regardless of atmospheric conditions. The case would stand as testament to both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of moral compromise, a duality that Holmes encountered repeatedly, yet never ceased to find profoundly disturbing.
The evening shadows had begun to gather across Baker Street when Inspector Lestrade returned with unexpected news that cast the afternoon's revelations in an even more sobering light. He carried with him a document that Dr. Adrian Thornbury had composed in his cell, a comprehensive confession that revealed the true extent of his meticulous planning and the psychological torment that had driven him to such desperate measures. The fellow has provided a complete account of his methods, Lestrade announced, settling into his familiar chair. 2 years of research, Watson. He consulted rare manuscripts at the British Museum, corresponded with European toxicologists under false names, even tested his delivery mechanism on laboratory animals to ensure its efficacy. As the invisible silk threads were not purchased but manufactured in his own makeshift laboratory using techniques adapted from surgical suture production. Holmes listened with that peculiar intensity that marked his engagement with the criminal mind's workings. Most instructive, and his framing of Captain Blackwood? Calculated in every detail, the arsenic planted during routine visits, the false moustache and military bearing when purchasing materials, even ensuring the cab driver would witness someone matching the captain's description. He orchestrated every element of the deception while maintaining his facade as the devoted secretary. Lestrade paused, consulting his notes. He emphasizes repeatedly his sister's complete innocence and expresses profound remorse for the suffering his actions have caused her. After the inspector departed, Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street with an expression of profound melancholy. A mind capable of such sophistication yet so fundamentally flawed in its ethical foundation, he observed quietly. The case illustrates a principle I have encountered throughout my career, Watson. Intelligence divorced from moral principle becomes merely a more efficient instrument of destruction. Dr. Thornbury possessed the brilliance to advance medical science, yet he employed those same gifts to orchestrate murder with unprecedented subtlety. The silence that followed was heavy with contemplation. I found myself reflecting on the various lives that had been irrevocably altered by this affair. Captain Blackwood had received an unexpected reprieve, though whether he would profit from this narrow escape remained uncertain. Miss Thornbury faced a future shadowed by her brother's crimes despite her complete innocence. Even Sir Reginald, for all his wealth and influence, had ultimately fallen victim to the very leverage he had attempted to wield. Holmes seemed to share my melancholy reflections as he retrieved his violin from its case. Drawing the bow across the strings, he began one of those plaintive improvisations that marked his most contemplative moods. The melody was haunting and minor-keyed, seeming to capture both the grey spirit of the London fog and the tragic waste of a brilliant mind corrupted by desperation and misguided devotion. The confession reveals something else of significance, Holmes murmured, lowering his instrument. Even as Thornbury implemented his murderous scheme, some remnant of his medical oath compelled him to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail. The anonymous letter was his attempt to reconcile his protective instincts with the recognition that his actions constituted a profound moral transgression. He required an audience capable of appreciating his intellectual achievement, even if that audience proved to be the instrument of his destruction. The fog pressed against our windows like some malevolent presence, and I understood that while we had successfully unravelled the mystery and prevented a grave injustice, the human cost would resonate far beyond our immediate resolution. Justice had been served through rigorous logic and patient observation, yet the satisfaction that typically accompanied our successful cases remained elusive, tempered by the recognition that the finest minds, when corrupted by fear and desperation, could create tragedies that diminished us all. As Holmes returned his violin to its case, I sensed that this particular case would linger in both our memories, a sobering reminder of the thin line that separates genius from moral corruption and the terrible price exacted when that line is crossed. The weeks that followed brought the inevitable machinery of justice into motion, though the trial of Dr. Adrian Thornbury, conducted under his assumed identity of Victor Ashford, proved less dramatic than the crime itself. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession complete, and the verdict never in doubt. The medical experts who testified regarding the digitalis delivery system spoke with grudging admiration for its ingenuity, though none could condone its application. Thornbury conducted his own defence with quiet dignity, making no attempt to excuse his actions, yet expressing profound remorse for the suffering he had caused his sister. Miss Catherine Thornbury departed London immediately following the trial, accepting a modest settlement that Captain James Blackwood, in an unexpected gesture of generosity, provided from his inheritance. She sought obscurity in a northern teaching position, her intelligence finding peaceful, though less brilliant employment than the tragic circumstances that had defined her recent years. The captain himself, sobered by his narrow escape from the gallows, resigned his commission to manage the estate with a newfound sense of responsibility that astonished his former associates. Holmes, however, remained fixated upon the anonymous letter that had initiated our involvement. On our final evening discussing the case, he held the cream-coloured paper before the fireplace, studying the disguised handwriting with that peculiar mixture of professional admiration and profound regret that marked his engagement with the criminal mind at its most sophisticated. "This document represents the most psychologically revealing evidence I have encountered, Watson," he observed, his voice carrying the weight of deep contemplation. It was simultaneously Thornbury's boldest stroke and his ultimate undoing. The anonymous warning was not merely intellectual vanity, though vanity played its part. It was the unconscious confession of a conscience that could not entirely surrender to moral corruption. He could not prevent himself from committing murder, yet neither could he allow an innocent man to suffer for his crime. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street. The tragedy lies in the fundamental misconception that intellectual brilliance confers moral authority. Thornbury possessed the knowledge to advance medical science, yet he employed those same gifts to orchestrate death with unprecedented subtlety. He forgot that the very faculty which enabled him to manipulate physical causes bound him all the more strictly to the consequences of their misuse. With deliberate ceremony, Holmes returned to the fireplace and cast the letter into the flames. We watched in silence as the paper blackened and crumbled, its secrets consumed by the fire that had warmed our many consultations. "The friend in shadows has stepped into the light," Holmes murmured, "and the light has destroyed him. It is the oldest of stories, yet it never fails to be tragic. The symbolic destruction seemed to mark the case's true conclusion. Holmes straightened with that characteristic transition from contemplation to action, moving toward his chemistry table, where a retort bubbled gently over a spirit lamp. "And now, Watson, if you would be so good as to hand me that precipitating glass, I believe we have devoted quite enough time to the failures of human nature." The laws of chemistry, unlike the motives of men, remain mercifully consistent. As Holmes settled back into his scientific work with focused intensity, I reflected that whatever darkness might walk the streets of London, there remained one force in Baker Street capable of bringing it to light. The Blackwood case was closed, filed away in the recesses of my friend's encyclopedic memory, leaving only the faint smell of chemical reagents and the lesson that no deception, however elaborate, could long withstand the application of rigorous logic and patient observation. The fog pressed against our windows, but within our familiar haven, order had been restored once more.